Welcome to the Vocation and the Common Good podcast. I'm your host, Philip Lourish. Today my guest is Nicole Baker Fulgham, former teacher and founder of the Expectations Project. Nicole is also the author of 2 books, Educating All God's Children and Schools in Crisis. Recently, Christianity Today named her one of the top 50 women leaders influencing the church and culture. I really hope you enjoy our conversation.
My God, wherever I go, glory. Where I reap and where I sow, glory. And my hands, they grip the thorn, glory.
I lead an organization called the Expectations Project. We've been around for about 5 years now, and our mission is to equip, train, and mobilize faith communities and faith leaders to become advocates to help improve low-income public schools. So we know that a lot of churches and faith communities do what we would call direct service with public schools. So backpack supplies, tutoring, mentoring, all of those things which we think are good and necessary. Kids need all of those things. But when we look at the massive systemic inequalities in any city, in any school district, there are just some pretty large, we'd call them systemic giants, that are holding kids in an entire school district back. So if you have a city that doesn't have any funding or adequate support to even have preschool, what does that do for low-income families who can't afford to spend $10,000 or $15,000 on preschool? So we look at the bigger picture issues and train people of faith to become advocates and use their voice to help bring change to those issues at the sort of public policy and systemic level.
So a good day then is feeling like the churches and faith communities that you're attempting to mobilize and serve are actually taking up this work on their own.
It is. And we know that our job is to be an equipper and a catalyst and to help them with strategy. But if it's really going to live and thrive, it's going to live and thrive beyond us, right? Our organization can't be in every city and in every, school district. So we're looking to really help change the environment at the national level so people of faith realize, oh, this is one of many issues connected to justice that we should be doing something about. So I taught 5th grade in Compton, California for a few years through a program called Teach for America. And I grew up in the city of Detroit, so I saw education inequality in my own community right outside of my front door. So I wasn't surprised at the level of inequality with the kids that I worked with in Compton. What I took from my experience in Detroit growing up there and assumed about the kids in Compton is that they were just as smart as everyone else, because in my community, I know what we did and didn't have access to, but I also know that every single person that I grew up with was brilliant and witty and had limitless potential. But how are the schools set up to help ensure that that happens, given a lot of the challenges that some of the families in my community brought to school, right? Just the differences that poverty often makes. And so teaching in Compton, I saw the same thing, but my assumption was, okay, so yes, we're in 5th grade here and 2/3 of the class is reading or doing math at a 2nd grade level or below. I have several kids who are functionally illiterate. Yes, that is the reality, but the assumption is that we have to figure out how to get kids a lot further along than they were when they came into the classroom.
What would you have wanted from the church as a teacher of 5th graders in Compton?
So as a teacher of 5th graders, what I wanted and started to see actually, which is part of why I'm doing the work I do now, is I knew that students who were that far behind weren't going to catch up during the regular school day, right? The 8 to 2:30 or 3 o'clock just isn't enough time if you're 3 and 4 grades behind. So we set up after school tutoring, Saturday tutoring, meet at the McDonald's in Compton or the library. And so my church was a natural place to go to ask people to volunteer, to be a part of that. And so that's what they did for me as a teacher. They also did do the things I mentioned earlier, bringing supplies to my students because the school district was financially strapped and we often didn't have enough books and pencils for the kids. And they really provided a source for me of extra support, but also, they prayed for me. They prayed for my students, in legal ways outside of the classroom. But knowing I had that support meant a lot. What I started to see, though, as a teacher was the things that impacted why my 5th graders were so far behind had started years ago, in some cases decades ago, right? With poverty in the city and the community, budget shortfalls at the state level, just a lot of, again, the challenges that often come along with families growing up in poverty. And how do we deal with that? What are the right policies and systems that need to be in place to ensure that regardless of where a kid comes from and what their family's background is, they can have a school system that's going to allow them to achieve, and as we've been talking a lot about today, to allow them to flourish. And again, my personal perspective is that we need more people who are going to push elected officials and decision makers to do the right thing more often and hold them accountable when they don't.
I mean, I'm assuming that it's easier to mobilize Christians to get backpacks together than it is to hold their elected officials accountable.
In the short term, I would say yes, because there's also something gratifying about, oh my gosh, we got 1,000 backpacks. The church I go to in the DC area does the same thing, right? We got all these backpacks. It's amazing. We feel really good. And the kids literally need supplies, right? So there's nothing.
We're pro backpacks.
Exactly. We're pro backpacks. We don't disagree with that. But we did some public polling data of Christians to ask that exact question. If you had it's kind of a false choice, but what do you see as more important and what are you more inclined to do, short-term direct service or work for long-term systemic change? And again, probably a little bit, skewed in the way we asked the question, but a higher percentage of people said they wanted to work for long-term sustainable change. And the reasons are, I think, pretty rational as you hear it, because they want to do something that they know is going to last and make a bigger difference on not just 100 kids, but maybe 10,000 kids in a city. That's very gratifying. So the inclination is there, which was encouraging to us, but getting people to want to stick with that for, sometimes those types of, public policy or big picture changes can take 2-3 years to see happen. There's going to be wins along the way and then some losses. And it just can feel, I think, amorphous for people who aren't used to kind of dealing in that, we've been working on this for, 18 months and nothing is fully changed yet. I believe that there's impact you make when you work on an issue along the way. You build your own capacity, you build your voice, you do a lot in the community, but getting people to want to stick with it, I think sometimes is a challenge.
What sustains you in that fight? Could you figure out how you're nourished and up for it to keep going and then reverse engineer that into other folks? Is that the goal?
That's a good question. I'd never really thought about it that way. I know what nourishes me is that I've seen examples of when it has worked. Having those wins and those moments when you can see, oh, right, this actually happened. We actually saw public funding at the state level for kids in Indiana growing up in low-income families to be able to get that money to go to preschool. That never happened before in the state ever. That's pretty amazing, right? So seeing that sustains me. I don't know how to reverse engineer that for other people. I also just know I'm a little obsessive about this issue. And so I'm always going to probably, fight for it until I can't breathe anymore.
Of the Lord is the meekness of the Lord, who bore humanity with brave humility. Let your mercy flow through us. Your mercy. Your mercy, let your mercy.
I think I got obsessive about it when I was in high school. Growing up in Detroit, I got accepted to a public exam high school, which is, what it sounds like. I know there are a lot of those here in New York City and other places. And so I was kind of in this elite public school that was almost like a private school. And we had so many other opportunities with AP classes, and many of my teachers, had PhDs in their subject area, and they assumed we were going to college. And it was mostly African-American because Detroit is mostly Black, but just really looking at the difference between all the kids who went to the neighborhood high school and realizing, they don't have AP classes. No one's talked to them about college in 4 years. They don't know what the SAT or ACT is. This is sort of crazy. So for me, that fueled it initially. And then I worked on some tutoring programs and things like that in college and got a chance to see more of that. And then once I taught in Compton, it was on.
I've been wanting to ask you about expectations, about the name, how you chose it, and what it signals for you about the importance of this work. What's the value of increasing expectations? Expectations for whom? How's that function?
Well, expectations and holding kids to high expectations academically is just a core belief that I have, again, from my experience and seeing, they said we were going to college and 99% of us did, right? And it's not that simple, right? There's a whole lot of other things that have to go into that to make sure kids can achieve that. But time after time, in some of the most challenging communities, and even in schools that are just regular neighborhood schools that didn't require an entrance exam like mine did, we see this phenomenon where if a school culture and a group of teachers and parents and community leaders decide, regardless of what happens, we're going to make sure that every single third grader in this school is reading on grade level by the time they leave third grade. There's just this sort of incredible focus and tenacity. And it's not that it doesn't require a ton of extra time or resources or support, But I feel like we don't even start there a lot of times with kids in our communities, because you look at someone's life circumstance, and this is easy to do, and you think, oh my gosh, their family is really struggling financially. They have a 2-room apartment and there's like 12 people living there, or the kids' parents are incarcerated, or they're homeless. How could we possibly expect all of those kids? They just moved here. They don't speak any English. How could we expect them to ever be able to achieve? I think most of us don't say that, but I think it's very easy to think it and have it deep in our own sort of biases and subconscious ideas about who we think is going to make it. Like, I don't think anyone looks at an upper middle class kid from the suburbs whose skin is lighter than mine and thinks, oh, that kid's really not going to, he's probably going to be a high school dropout. Like, very few people would say that. He very well might be for a variety of other reasons, right? Most people aren't going to think that, but
Right.
we're sort of have these ideas. And so for me, making sure that we hold every child to high expectations and helping them get there is just, you can't do anything if you don't do that.
Does that also create the possibility for a community within a classroom that can then increase a degree of mutual accountability that we could extend outside of a classroom? I mean, I'm thinking right now of my own daughter's first grade class where there were 7 different languages spoken in the home. We have a very large IRC population, like a lot of refugees that get resettled in Charlottesville. And one of the things that was remarkable about spending time in her class, particularly during an election year, and particularly during this election year,
Sure.
was the ways in which I saw a lot of our broader social dynamics existing within this small community of 20 first graders at Johnson Elementary School. And I saw signs of hope within that classroom because there was a teacher that was there to say, all of you are welcome. We're going to take care of you. You're going to learn. You're going to be nurtured. And there are forms of language and insult that may be going on out there. But in here, this is a community. It was an oddly hopeful moment where I thought everybody's coming into this with different stuff. But for these hours during the day, these kids are all nurtured and they're creating the possibility of a social order that is going to work against what seems to be present outside these doors. How do you think about a classroom? Is a classroom just a mini society that we're training children to be citizens?
I think in an ideal world, yes. So we're going to either train them to be citizens, or it's going to be this incredibly dysfunctional little experiment that reinforces sort of the worst divisions or stereotypes about kids. And so when we think about who we look for to be teachers, to stand in front of any class of kids, right? Because diversity is everywhere. But again, certainly for kids who are more vulnerable and more likely to be on the margins, that person matters so much. And it's one of the things that, we think about what's happening in education. We talk a lot about testing and getting kids to standards. And I certainly believe in all of that. I don't think tests are everything, but I think they are a quantifiable snapshot of something, right? I think the trends matter, right? When you see, vast majority of kids of color or kids from low-income backgrounds are doing, 30, 40 percentage points lower than others, there's something to learn from that. You can't dismiss it. But at the same time, people that are going to be able to get in front of a classroom of kids and create that type of culture you're describing takes something more than just being able to break down an algebra objective and make sure that everyone learns it, right? They themselves have to come to the table with some degree of being aware of their own biases, having some level of cultural competency, being able to create an environment where everyone feels safe and like they can bring their whole selves to that. Like, that's really hard to do. I mean, most adults, right, in group settings, whether it's your church small group or, your workplace, like, it's hard for us to do that. And so to be able to be that sort of savvy and knowledgeable about how to develop that type of culture for a group of 8-year-olds is impressive. And when you see a teacher who can do the academics and that, like, it's a thing of beauty. I mean, teaching is an art and a science.
I thought if there was any justice in the world, this person would be making a whole lot more money.
Well, there's that too. Yeah, it's the easiest thing for every politician to campaign on, and then they generally don't deliver on that.
Is raising teacher salaries.
Yeah, oh yeah.
Yeah.
It's an easy one, but
Yeah.
again, doing it is much harder.
Teach us to number the length of our days. Pour out your power. We'll pour out your praise. Teach us to run, to finish the race. For only what's done and love will remain.
I've been wanting to ask you about the sort of tension between the creation of citizens capable of empathy, capable of some sort of mutual understanding, and then also the hard stuff of education as credential, as kind of a ticket to a better life. And how you think about this. How do you balance that tension? Is there tension there? And what do you think is most important for churches right now to get behind supporting educators in their midst, in their cities?
When I started the Expectations Project, and even throughout my career, I've been pretty solely focused on the academic side of ensuring that every kid can achieve at high levels, because there's so much there that allows them to be more upwardly mobile, to have access to power, all of those things that I think, most people want for their kids. Most people want their child to go to college, regardless of where they're growing up. But the last few years, I have to say, when I think about what the church and faith communities can uniquely contribute to this space, yes, we should be doing that. But there has to be something more that we're contributing. Part of why I started this organization is because the discourse about public education has gotten so nasty in our country. We're not talking about as much now, but, this idea that if you said one thing, you didn't care about teachers. If you said something else, you don't really care about the kids. It's been pretty ugly for the last several years. And I believe deeply that at our best, faith communities are, one, able to bring a more civil level of discourse, and that we can learn to, talk about things and still be passionate about it, but not insulting, right? So if you take that and extrapolate it to the classroom, I think in our country right now, we need more of that, probably more than we ever have, certainly in my adult lifetime. And from a public policy standpoint, right? Like, I don't know how you sort of would architect that. Like, I don't know what you do to help support that, other than with the way we do our work, we're trying to model that. And if there are ideas out there about how to instruct or create a classroom environment that we can invest more money in helping teachers figure out how to do that, that would be something we could advocate for. I wouldn't have said that probably 10 years ago. I probably would have said, oh my gosh, like every kid needs to have Algebra 1 by the time they're finished ninth grade, which I still, or eighth grade, honestly. I still agree with that too, but I don't know how we solve our country's problems. It's great if everyone can get a tech job and like be in the STEM field, but if we're as nasty as we are right now to each other as a nation 20 years from now, like it sort of won't matter that you know how to code and program a robot, right? Like I don't know how we even live with each other. And there's got to be more to this work. It has to be academic and something else.
And if we could name that well and advocate for it, that would be important.
It would be. And I know there are people who are thinking about it, just this idea of looking at children as sort of the whole person, which many people have been doing forever, right? It's not a new idea, but just being thoughtful about where kids have experienced trauma. Well, that doesn't mean you suspend them when they do something wrong in class. Maybe it's the trauma that's contributing to that. Or if they have a mental health challenge, it's not about kicking them out of class in the first infraction. How do we support the whole student? So I think it's akin to that. And I think as we grow in that space and people are doing more quantifiable research, of course, on trauma and other issues and how it impacts the brain and kids' ability and readiness to learn, I'm hopeful that we will start to look more holistically beyond academics, now to trauma, socio-emotional well-being, getting into other parts of kids' lives and what we want from them. Again, advocating for that, naming it, I think would be important. And I think it's something we're exploring, and I'm hopeful that others are too. The kids I taught in Compton, most of them were, 3-4 grade levels behind. But by the end of that school year, I saw kids grow 2 and 3 grade levels in reading. So kids who couldn't read at the beginning of the year were reading chapter books by the end of the year, or they couldn't do, basic 2 and 3 digit subtraction, but they were doing complex fractions by the end of the year. And as a brand new teacher, anyone who would advise me like, that's actually a growth goal that's unrealistic and you should do something more realistic. I just didn't know that. And so for me, seeing that happen and seeing the faces of kids who literally, when we started to work on concepts in the beginning of the year, would tell me, Miss Baker, like, I'm just done. Like, don't waste your time. Like, I had literally had kids tell me that. And to see their faces by the end of the year and see that sense of accomplishment when they would see how much, that was very clear, and like showing them, here's what you've done. You started here, you ended here. Academically, like that, you can't pay for that, right? And to be able to witness that, again, in kids that I would say society may largely write off as not able to accomplish much. No one can ever convince me that every kid can achieve. You could never talk me out of it, as irrational as it may sound. And so for me, that's what keeps me going, is the faces and the expressions of kids whose self-esteem literally changed when they realized that, no, actually, you are pretty smart.
Oh, we labor on to glory till heaven and earth are one. Oh, we labor on to glory until God's kingdom come.
Vocation in the Common Good is a production of New City Commons and the Narrativo Group. This episode was produced by Mike Cosper and Philip Lourish. It was edited by TJ Hester, and it was mixed by Mark Owens.
Rain it pours and beats the ground. Glory, dust it blows and